ahead and move to our first briefing item, which is an update on the DPD's cannabis enforcement. And I think we're going to be joined by Chief Garcia, as well as Assistant Chief, Deputy Chief Ruben Ramirez. Good afternoon, Command Staff.
Good afternoon, Council Member. We'll just turn it over to Ruben right now to walk us through where we're at.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We'll start with the presentation overview. We are going to focus on the current marijuana laws, February 2021 marijuana data, the purpose of these proposed changes, proposed marijuana enforcement procedures. I'll give a testing update and then we'll end with next steps. As we've mentioned before, the current marijuana laws are that any usable amount of marijuana is illegal. Possession of under 4 ounces is eligible for cite and release citation. Between 2 and 4 ounces is a Class A misdemeanor. As of June 10th, 2019, hemp is legal to possess in Texas, and this was a product of House Bill 1325. And again, just the definition, hemp is cannabis with a THC concentration of less than 0.3% concentration. Next slide is our overview of a snapshot of marijuana in February of 2021. This snapshot covers the dates of the 1st of February to the 24th of February. The total number of all arrests in the city of Dallas was 1,996. Total number of drug-related arrests is 402, which makes up 20% of all arrests. Marijuana-related arrests made up 183, or 9% of all arrests. And for less than 2 ounces of marijuana, there were 140 arrests in the month of February, which makes up 7% of all arrests. And then there were additional 9 cite and release citations issued in February. The purpose of the proposed changes is to avoid the impact of arresting individuals for low-level amounts of marijuana, to eliminate charges for individuals who are in possession of marijuana for personal consumption only. A note, 70% of the charges filed are indicative of possession of marijuana only, not with intent to distribute. And to lessen the burden and time on DPD resources, and that would be the processing of evidence, the booking, and the report writing, etc. The proposed marijuana enforcement procedures are that officers will not charge offenders for possession of marijuana of less than 2 ounces, except in the following circumstances. The possession of less than 2 ounces of marijuana is indicative of distribution, meaning that the offender is in possession of multiple smaller individual baggies packaged for resale. There is a presence of digital scales, packs of empty baggies, etc. Observed in hand-to-hand drug transactions, or the offender was involved in a drug-related call for police service or a narcotics division investigation, and any other additional circumstances that would lead officers to believe that the marijuana the offender possessed was for resale purposes and not personal consumption. The proposed marijuana enforcement procedures also includes an exception of if the offender possessed the under 2 ounces of marijuana in conjunction with a firearm, the offender has a criminal history with multiple convictions for violent offenses, the offender has a companion charge for a crimes against person in conjunction with the marijuana possession. In these instances, the officer will not charge the offender if the offender has a companion drug charge of a felony penalty grade. If the companion case is an active hold or arrest warrant, and if circumstances of the possession indicate that the possession was for personal consumption only. So these are 3 instances in which officers will not charge the offender. An update on testing procedures. These are changes that have already been implemented by DPD. Marijuana is no longer automatically sent to SWIFTs for testing. Only marijuana charges accepted by the district attorney's office are being sent to SWIFTs for analysis. And these are changes that have already occurred. As we look forward, next steps, we'll focus on the reporting procedures and the documentation required, the reporting required. We'll focus on deposit locations for drug evidence to maximize officer efficiency, designating lockboxes, drug lockboxes in certain locations, and the procedures for general orders implementation. That concludes the presentation. I'll hand it over to Chief Garcia for some comments.
Yeah, thank you, Ruben. Just some considerations as well as we move forward. Obviously, one of the dynamics with this is we certainly aren't by this policy, we're not making it allowable, or nor do we think should be allowable for individuals to openly smoke marijuana in public. That's certainly not the intent of the policy. If they do have, obviously just a single joint that they're walking around the street, that's not our intent with this. The other dynamic is we get about 6,800 calls per year about open drug sales. 3,000 of those go directly to narcotics, and another 3,800 or so actually get called in to 911 centers. One of the dynamics that we need to see, and one of the reasons why we're very, very pleased that we were allowed to work with this policy, is that depending on the cat and mouse game that goes on between dealers and police that has been going on for years, as they tweak their operations, we need to tweak our policies as well. And so one of the dynamics is obviously if we start seeing more of those calls coming in, we may need to tweak our policy. If we see the dealers are operating in a different method because they'll know what the threshold is, then we're going to have to tweak policy. And so that's one of the dynamics of us being allowed to work with this in case we have to come back and say that we're having issues and we're going to need to tweak it again. So one last thing, when we talk about procedures for general orders and implementation, one of the dynamics is we need to look at our policies with regards to the autonomy and allowing officers to use discretion in smaller in cases where there's small amounts of petty crimes and other things to allow officers to use more discretion. Because right now we need to be more in line with the Code of Criminal Procedure and the Texas Penal Code. And we're going to be looking at our policies to do that. But again, I just want to make sure that we highlight the fact that, there's a possibility of having some unintended consequences that if those do come to fruition, that we'll be having to tweak our policies in order to meet those needs of our community.
All right. Is that all on your side? Are you ready to take questions from the committee members?
We're ready.
All right. Thanks. Committee members, I won't call on you individually. I'll start with Vice Chair. I'm going to call on everybody, and I am going to put you on timers just because we have a long agenda today. I want to make sure we get through everything. Let me get my timer. This is running the meeting and being the timer is fun. So we'll go ahead and start. We'll do 5 minutes, and you don't have to take all your 5 minutes if you don't want, but we'll start with Vice Chair Kleinman.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Chief. I appreciate you bringing these policies forward. That's all I got at this time, but I do appreciate you digging into it and kind of taking it off of our table. The direction we're going with the ordinance probably wasn't necessary, and I'm glad you're able to take care of it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councilmember.
All right, thank you. Next, Councilmember Arnold, do you have any questions? Okay, I don't hear anything from her. Councilmember Basil Dua.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the command staff. Thank you, Chief Garcia, for the implementation. I just ask that we have some type of review of the metrics of the implementation. I guess maybe 6 months after it is implemented, so that we can see its impact, if any. That's the only request that I have, I agree that I'm very thankful that it's being implemented by you, Chief. I think that the last thing we want to do is law enforcement's job, and so a problem was identified, and here we are on a policy that I was personally working on over a year, and you came in within a month, are taking charge to that. So very appreciative of your leadership, very hopeful for what that means for our city going forward. Thank you to everyone there.
Thank you, Councilman.
All right. Councilmember Blewett. You have any questions?
Ma'am.
All right. You're on the clock.
All right, thanks. Hey, Chief. First of all, I appreciate Mr. Basil Dua's effort on this subject, and I will second the idea that I don't think that on council that we should be writing ordinances for all the different nuances of police work. I do appreciate the idea of keeping this in-house. General orders makes a lot more sense to me. It seems to me if I was in your position that I'd want flexibility, which isn't just, coming back and telling us how it's working. It's what you touched on. And that's the idea that you can tweak this as needed. So I like hearing that. That was the main point that I wanted to hear, is that you would be able to revise this if we needed to. So that's good. You also touched on my other comment was going to be on active users in public spaces as opposed to just people who have it on their possession. So to be clear, we are not legalizing, and people walking down the street that are openly using, that is still being enforced, correct?
Yes, sir. In no way is that allowable. Furthermore, I think one thing to be clear is that this still does not negate any probable cause that our officers have in the field to perform their duties. It's just if at the end of their investigative stops, if the things that were outlined are what we discussed with regards to personal use, then we will go that route. But in no way are we saying that it is allowable to use marijuana in public and to smoke it in public. And in no way are we negating officers' probable cause from doing investigations out in the field.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to hear. So I think I'm in a pretty good place with this. I am moderately optimistic that general orders is a way that we can approach other things as well. So I'll ask you a question that in your previous life in San Jose, is this a common thing that you did, is just tweak general orders when issues came up, or are we trying to do it a little different here? Can you compare and contrast for me?
You know what, Councilmember, with this particular issue, in California, there's Props 47, which were propositions that were voted on by state mandates, which really forced our hand in law enforcement to deal with issues like this. But certainly, to me, I think it's not just what I've done in my past life, but just what makes sense with regards that if we have the ability to tweak these things, particularly when it comes to public safety, and I'll just say it, fighting crime. As I mentioned before, it's a cat and mouse game that's been going on for ages, and by being able to do this, it enables us to tweak it because as they get smarter, we have to get smarter as well.
Yeah, I like that. Let me ask you one other thing. So recently you announced some command staff changes, a lot of internal people. I think a lot of people are happy with that. And it goes to your last bullet point, procedures for general orders implementation. Can you talk a little bit about your conversations with the command staff, their support and encouragement for going this direction? I'd like to hear how the team thinks about what we're doing here.
Well, to be frank with you, it was we all rode in the same direction, and we haven't really had much discussion with regards to what they thought. We're a team, and it was a vision that I had, that we had, that I will say collectively to get there. But the command staff input was more of, this is what we need to make happen. Let's make it happen, and that's what happened.
Well, I mean, more along the lines of implementation. So it's not just going to be you implementing; it's going to be your team and the different chiefs, majors, sergeants. So is it early yet to talk about what the implementation is going to look like with the staff?
You mean with regards to this policy, or? Oh, okay, no. Well, one of the things we have to do, we still have to work on those considerations that we talked about earlier, right? We gotta figure out and make it easier for our officers if they are not having to drive up to headquarters to leave the contraband. If there's an easier way for them to safely secure it somewhere, the paperwork that needs to be done. Is there an easier route to complete that paperwork now that you're booking contraband? And so we're going to be working the team. It's going to be imperative that the team work together because the training at the front end with our officers working on the field is what's imperative. And so there is going to be collaboration because we're going to need to get that training down to our officers.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm going. Is obviously we're at the front end of this, right? So I mean, you got the general orders, and now we got to do implementation, which you touched on. So, as long as your team's on board and you're this is the direction we're going, I like it. I support it. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councilmember.
All right, thank you. Chair Magoo, are you on? Okay, do you have any questions?
I do.
Okay, I'll hand it to you next. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll just add my voice, Chief. Thank you for jumping in this and taking leadership of the issue and identifying I think, some really good steps in how to address this issue for our city. And I just want to say thank you for doing that. I got some of the questions as related to the open offenses. That was an issue that Councilmember Blewett asked about, and I appreciate that. There are two other areas I want to ask about that weren't specifically mentioned that I've talked about in the past. One is how's it handled with vehicular incidents such as driving under the influence or driving while intoxicated when we're determining whether it's marijuana use or alcohol, or how is that addressed in this? Will there be testing if there's substances in the car, is that kind of thing, or what's the impact there?
Thank you, Councilmember Magoo. If you don't mind, I'll answer that. So the procedures when there is an intoxicated motorist will involve contacting someone from our traffic division, and a HGN certification officer will arrive at the scene, and he'll be able to test and either through odor or behaviors be able to determine whether or not the driver is impaired through alcohol or some other substance that's not alcohol. If it's determined that it's not alcohol, the testing is fairly similar. They'll still look at the balance, the unsteady balance, the eyes, the fluctuation within the eyes, to determine if the driver is impaired. Now, if there are products or substances in the vehicle that we believe contributed to that impairment that are not alcohol, they'll still be seized. They'll still be placed in the property room. It'll still be identified in the narrative of the arrest report for driving while intoxicated. But they won't be charged with it at this time. But there won't be, unlike the ordinance or something that might have impeded our ability or excluded our ability to be able to use it for enforcement purposes, that won't be the case. It will still be documented and deposited, just not a subsequent charge.
Okay. A similar question on property crime and potential individuals that are either breaking into cars or homes. And I know that there had been some issues with possession in those cases. And is that how will this current status deal with those situations? Are we able to still, if we know there's a serial offender in certain areas, how do we address that if the possession is what I think traditionally might have been the entry point?
Well, I think, Councilmember, those are one of the things that we, particularly now, we can take a look at within 6 months of implementing the policy to see if this is something that we need to tweak with regards to how does it affect property crime and things of that nature. And so that's definitely something that we'll take a look at. One thing I'll say just previously with regards to the testing, one of the dynamics, and I'll tell you this, one of the questions that I often had, again, we'll talk about my old life in California, was that we have to be very mindful about these things, because when we talk about impairment while we're driving, when you're driving under the influence of alcohol, there's a 0.08 limit, right? There's a limit that we have set. There is not yet a magical tool that can test one's breath to see the THC levels in their system. And we have not yet set a standard as to what amount of THC is too much to drive. That hasn't occurred anywhere. And so that's one of the pauses that I have, that this is more of a complicated issue when we discuss that. And so to answer your previous question, I just wanted to add that tidbit in that, that's the one reservation that I have. I had it back in my old life, and I'll have it still here, is that we really do need to work harder at figuring out what that legal impairment level is when people are using driving and having used cannabis.
Thank you, Chief, and I appreciate both those responses and looking into it, and as it relates to the property crimes as well. The other point I would just, as we've gone through this discussion, have seen the connection between the violent crime and nexus to some of these either drug houses or entry points to this. How does the current policy being proposed address continuing to be able to take a look at the whatever connection is there or is not there, and how this could impact our addressing drug houses in that situation?
Well, Councilman, what I'll say is drug houses absolutely get no passes from us, zero. And I'll say the tremendous work that our department has done in identifying drug houses that as we've said, disrupt criminal enterprises. The dynamic that I've seen in these drug houses, and it's usually that I've seen, it's cocaine, PCP, and marijuana. PCP and marijuana. Cocaine and marijuana. I haven't seen drug houses where the only drug they sell is marijuana. And so drug houses absolutely get zero passes from us. Number two, the one dynamic that I will say, the drug trade is about supply and demand. It's about supply and demand. And, one thing that we have to be mindful, and one thing that I alluded to earlier with the calls for service, if people operate with impunity, if the demand operates with impunity, that they can go to these places to buy their drugs and stay within under 2 ounces, then that may not have the effect we want with regards to neighborhoods still seeing traffic, with businesses still seeing traffic, with markets, liquor stores seeing traffic. And so that's one of the things that we will definitely have to take a look at and come back, because that is an issue. But let me make this clear. Absolutely, drug houses are getting zero passes from us, and that is a absolute focus of the police department.
Well, again, Chief, I appreciate your responses and focus on the issues, and saving resources where we can, and focusing on the real impacts in our communities and neighborhoods. So thank you, Chief. Thank you, your leadership team, for getting to this point as well, and thank you, Chairwoman.
All right, thank you, Chair Magoo, and I'm going to move to Chair Mendelson.
Thank you, and thank you to some of my colleagues for asking some of my questions. I appreciate that. I just want to clarify what we're talking about here. You are saying that you're no longer going to charge someone who has 2 ounces or less of marijuana, even though that is a crime in Texas. Is that right?
Unless it falls under the exceptions that we mentioned, yes.
So both Councilmember Magoo and Blewett have asked about people who are openly smoking marijuana, and you have said you would enforce that. But what specifically will you do? Is that a cite and release?
It would be more than likely a cite and release, ma'am.
Okay. So you mentioned some unintended consequences. What sort of unintended consequences have you considered could happen?
Well, again, an increase of that second prong to any sales as supply and demand. An increase in the demand, which then will have an impact on the possible increase in supply. Those are dynamics that may occur. There may be more traffic in our neighborhoods of concern. There may be more traffic near our businesses and grocery stores. And again, to Councilmember Magoo's point, we're going to take a look at to see if there's going to be any impact on increase in property crimes as well throughout with this issue. So again, thankful we had an opportunity to look at this ourselves, and from a policy perspective, because we may have to tweak it if some of those negative consequences do come to fruition. And particularly, again, the dynamic of people driving under the influence. Taking a look at that to see have we had an increase of individuals that were driving under the influence, that we can compare apples to apples from a time where that policy wasn't in place to where we have it now. So
I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not sure it's really fair to say you're going to compare driving under the influence when that requires that we have patrol stopping more cars. I mean, if we don't have enough patrol officers out there doing that work, then we may have an increase that you can't detect.
In which field, ma'am?
In driving
under the influence? Well, to the extent that we do, I mean, we do still make arrests for driving under the influence. There may not be, the numbers, but we will still have some comparative data to be able to look at.
Okay. So I'm wondering if we can look at slide 7 where you have your exceptions. And you have on there exceptions for crimes against person, where that would be a companion charge. But I'm wondering about crimes against property like burglary, theft from a motor vehicle, robbery, and motor vehicle theft, and crimes against society like animal cruelty and weapons violations, and why those would not also be companion charges.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Middleton. As the chief mentioned, this is our starting point. This is the launching point. When I've reported out since September on marijuana arrests, the categories that we highlighted were the ones that were most significant, and where marijuana was a secondary charge, and they were for crimes against persons in ag assault, robberies, and family violence. So we didn't see those other categories as categories where that marijuana was even a secondary charge or found in their possession.
So can I ask you this question? Are you finding that people are breaking into cars and stealing cars to support their drug habits?
I haven't looked at that data. I don't have any data to support that. I do know from 25 years experience that often people steal property and eventually take it to drug houses to purchase some type of drug in exchange for that property. So I know that exists. I just don't have any data, statistics to support that.
And the other people who are sitting around this table with all your years of experience, does your experience tell you that people are stealing property to support a drug habit?
But it's difficult to say, Councilmember, with regards to that. I will say that's generally not the type of drug, in my experience, where people feel necessarily the need to have the type of addiction, both physically and mental addiction, to use. I mean, I think part of people stealing property for drug use quite often stems from drugs where people have a physical and more increasingly dependency than necessarily marijuana.
Okay. Is this policy going to be in conflict with the district attorney's prosecution?
Well, what I'll say about the district attorney's prosecution, Councilmember, and thank you for the question. We've had a lot of discussion with regards to the district attorney and how they would prosecute certain things. Number one, I'm not quite. I think we've reconciled some things, but what I'll say is it's a very slippery slope for us. And one thing that I have to say is that we cannot look at how we enforce the law and public safety on our level and use the same standard that the district attorney uses. Our standard is based on a probable cause. The district attorney's standard is based on beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are two different standards. We have to base what we do out in the street on what we see if we have probable cause to make an arrest, and not think about what the consequences are later on as to whether or not a district attorney is going to file or not charges on that. That's not just here in Dallas. That's not the way the system should work anywhere in the country. We should not dictate how we do police work based on the decisions the district attorney makes. There's two different standards. I don't begrudge the district attorney for doing what they need to do, regardless where we're at, but it certainly should not dictate how we keep our community safe. I've said this example many times, but you know what? If the community calls us, if a neighborhood calls us 20 times to deal with a problem, we have to go back out 20 times and deal with the problem. And we can't base those decisions to take action and protect our community based on what a district attorney is going to decide to do in court.
Thank you. I agree with you. My next question is really just about the drug houses. You were just giving some examples to Deputy Mayor Pro Tem Magoo, and you said that there's no drug houses that are all marijuana, but then you cited many times where marijuana is one of the drugs being sold. How many of the drug houses that you're aware of have marijuana in it? Is it always? Is it usually? Is it sometimes?
Again, I don't want to speak in absolutes, but I would say, generally speaking, from what I've seen anecdotally, I'm sure there's probably a drug house somewhere in the city that just sells marijuana. I just have not seen that type of dynamic. If most times that we hit a house, we're finding multiple types of drugs. It may be that a few times we found just marijuana, but there's a good amount of times where there's multiple drugs involved.
So it's very clear you're going after the drug houses, and thank you for posting it on social media and having that conversation with the community about it. And clearly the drug houses are a nuisance in our communities and fueling crime, but the drug houses are then supplying the 2 ounces or less that we're now not going to enforce. I mean, you want to shut down one, but yet you're allowing the second. So that seems fairly inconsistent to me. But I do appreciate that you've taken this issue and that you've owned it and that you've come up with a solution that will work for you. And I'm going to support that. So thank you.
I appreciate it, Councilmember. If I could just elaborate on one of the points you made. I mean, listen, one of the reasons that we're moving forward is it's like a 1A and 1B. Number one, it is to ensure that our officers are out trying to get individuals and being visible in areas of concern, more readily available, and to make arrests on individuals that may have a propensity for violence. As I've proud of the officers when we're getting drugs and guns, when we're going out after the individuals that we know that are causing violence in our community. So number one is to give our officers more free time to do that. I don't believe any officer, particularly ones that are going to buy into our vision of impacting violent crime, want to spend 4 to 6 hours in jail with an individual solely for personal use of marijuana. I just don't feel that's a good use and efficient use of our time. And then number two, the equity issue. I'm not naive to the equity issue as well. We will have more presence in our areas of concern in the city, and unfortunately, those areas are communities of color, and so we do recognize that also. But again, this is not about DA's decision. This is about this police department concentrating on what we feel we need to concentrate at this point to be able to move the needle with regards to violent crime. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chair Thomas.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Chief, thank you for being with us last night down in my neighborhood virtually in the Mountain Creek, Sugarberry Woods area. They were really appreciative. We got to get that Wi-Fi worked out. Other than that, we had a very engaging conversation. So I want to thank you for that first. Regarding this, you asked us last month, give you some time, give you 30 days, let you take a look at this, and based on your due diligence and your recommendation after doing your homework, this is what you came up with. I think in light of where we are, in light of the climate as relates to taking a closer look at interactions between law enforcement and individuals living in Black and brown communities. We just received, I think a month ago, a briefing from our Office of Police Oversight Monitor regarding misdemeanors of this nature. And so I can be in support of this recommendation. I think it is important that we take the time and do a evaluation after this has been implemented, but I will be able to support this and look forward to seeing the positive effects that come from it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And then any other council members that are attending this meeting that are not part of the committee, do you want to speak? I don't see everybody, and I see Paul is present, Councilmember Blackman, but do you want to say anything, or is there anybody else?
No, thank you. I'm fine. Thanks.
Okay. I want to give opportunity for any other council members.
Chairwoman.
Yes. I called on you earlier. Do you want to say something?
I appreciate that. I'm working on trying to study a little bit more too. But first of all, Chief, excuse me. I do want to let you know that I do applaud you for your work. But what I really liked was the statement you made a few minutes ago, and I believe that's what we need to operate from. Operating and knowing what your lane is. We're operating on probable cause, and they're operating on the concept of doctrine of without a shadow of doubt. So being committed to doing your job is really what every officer should do, and not have to worry about what's going to happen. Just go ahead and worry about what's happening right now. So I believe that's where you're heading. Am I right?
You're 100%, council member, 100%.
I appreciate that. And if you would, I just needed you to, because I went out on just the slide number, the one on enforcement. Officers will not charge the offender if the offender has a companion drug charge or a felony penalty grade. Would you just review that for me 1 second? I forgot what slide.
Slide 8. I think it's slide 8, council member.
8. Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
Officers will not charge the offender if the offender has a companion drug charge of the felony penalty grade. Right. So council member, this made up some 27% of the secondary charges that we reported out since September of last year. Consistently 27% or higher. So it is it's a big portion of the secondary charges, and that felony penalty grade would be either cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, PCP.
Okay. So basically, you're going to let the higher charge prevail. Is that what you're saying?
Right. So each the arrestee in this case, if he had cocaine, for example, and marijuana, he would already be going to drug court in a felony drug court. So there isn't any reason for him to then go down to a misdemeanor court for the possession of marijuana. Right.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that so much. And right now, where I am, I'll listen to the rest of the questions. And right now, I'm just comfortable, and I have the support. You have my support in at least trying to get resolution. And as questions come up, I'll pose those whether online today or just offline. But I appreciate that, and thank you, Chairwoman. And you can pass on to the next council member. Thank you.
Muted.
Oh, I apologize. I'm ready to get back to in-person meetings when we don't have to hear muted, unmute, council member, you're muted. But that's another discussion. I think we've gone first round through everybody. Before I make my comments in summary to conclude this conversation, I'll take a second round if anybody has any other comments. I think everybody had an opportunity first round. All right, I don't hear anybody wanting to make any additional comments, so I will wrap up this. This has been an update, informational only. It's not an actionable item, but I would conclude by comments that were made. You have general support from the council. I think most importantly, we've asked you to decrease violent crime, make ourselves a safer city. At the end of this meeting, we're going to get to the dashboards that we discuss on a monthly basis. And we want you to have that strategy and be empowered and emboldened to be able to execute that strategy to get us the results. We want safe neighborhoods, safe communities, and we want everybody to be treated equitably. And we're empowering you to do that. So we don't take police policy general orders to council for approval. That's under your discretion. So it's not appropriate for us to take this as an action item. You've given us, you've answered a lot of our questions. I think you've heard our concerns. We want you to be flexible, and we want you to continue to address these drug houses and the problems that our communities are experiencing related to violent crime. And we know that you're going to have to be adaptable, which is why we don't want to have a policy that prohibits you from being adaptable and flexible. I think you've heard concerns, as I mentioned, that we want to make sure that this does not become or perceived as an allowance that we are doing something that conflicts with state law. We're not legalizing marijuana. We're doing something that's very similar. You're taking an action that's very similar to what our sister city, Fort Worth, has done in the past and what other cities in Texas have done. We're respecting the law. We're operating within the law, but we are allowing you to utilize your resources appropriately and in an equitable manner. And with that, I mean, I think you've heard concerns, you've heard general support, but we also want to see the results. We want to see what this is going to look like. And I think that the metrics that you've discussed, making sure that this doesn't have unintended consequences, looking at property crime, I think important. So I would ask that in 6 months or however often, I will be leaving this office and as chair of public safety in June. So the next chairman could decide to bring this forward monthly or whatever it might be. But I think we need to look at how this is affecting crime in general. Are we seeing violent crime because of resources differently? That we're seeing violent crime coming down, but we want to make sure we're not seeing property crime or other unintended consequences at the same time. And to the point about driving under the influence, well, if we had more people doing patrol related to that, then you might see more arrests. So I think operating the same, but making sure that we are evaluating that metric as well during this time period. Any other metrics that you think are relevant to determining the success or the implementation, all the consequences related to this policy change is appropriate. So I think you and I can have that discussion, but I think you've heard what we're concerned about. And, you know, obviously the arrest is a metric that we've been looking at, but those other ancillary concerns as well. So in the drug houses, I mean, I don't know how that's reflected. How many drug houses, we don't have a metric that says X amount of drug houses have been shut down, but we want to make sure those aren't proliferating as well. I know it's not like a count that we have readily available, but that I know anecdotally is something your department is monitoring. So with that, I will conclude, or unless Chief Garcia or Deputy Chief Ramirez has any other comments related to this, but thank you for your effort, your work, tackling this immediately. And I think council members, are going to be following this, and we want the positive results. We all want the same thing. We all kind of disagree often on how we're going to get there, but we want a safer city and safer neighborhoods and safer communities, so all Dallas residents can thrive. So with that, do you have any closing comments before we move on to the next briefing?
No, Councilmember.
All right. Well, thank you, and thank you.